Retirement in any form of motorsports, especially the retirement of a particular driver who's been the fixture of a particular fan's motorsports experience, is without a doubt a somber ordeal. But sometimes when a driver announces an end to their career, it doesn't always mean the end to their career. And so in today's video, I want to look back in NASCAR history at some instances when drivers went back on their word, took the keys, and left the retirement home. Going in chronological order of when drivers made their comeback, we begin with Curtis Turner in 1965. To talk about Turner's return, we have to go back a couple of years. Curtis needed some cash to fund his new project with the freshly built Charlotte Motor Speedway, so he and his business partner Bruton Smith organized a union in the hope of getting better purses, a share in broadcasting rights, and retirement benefits for the drivers. Bill France Sr. was wholly opposed to the idea of drivers creating their own unions and warned any driver who did so of a permanent ban. But surely they're not going to touch one of the sport's most popular drivers. Wrong. Curtis was subsequently banned from NASCAR. How long? For life. However, by 1965, Bill France Sr. had run into a problem. Some of the sport's most high-profile names and personalities were killed in a series of fatal accidents. The mid-60s was a dangerous time in NASCAR, and a stressful time at that. If some of the sport's biggest names, such as Joe Weatherly and Fireball Roberts, were killed, then some people would just stop watching. Bringing Curtis back is probably the last thing France wanted to do, but after being pegged by Charlotte Motor Speedway for obvious reasons, he reluctantly lifted the ban. Curtis ran 7 races in 1965 and did very well, scoring a win at Rockingham, his first since 1959, for the Wood brothers, along with 3 top 5s and 3 top 10s. For 1966, he picked up where he left off at the end of 1965 with the Wood brothers, driving the number 41 Ford for the first couple of races. Things were going good until Ford pulled their factory support out of NASCAR. Thus, Turner was left scrounging for opportunities. It worked out in the end, and he increased the number of races he'd run in 1966 at 21. The next few years, up until his retirement at the end of 1968, would see him scoring several more top 5s and top 10s for several more organizations on a limited schedule. Next, we have Fred Lorenzen. By the end of 1967, Lorenzen had a pretty solid career going for him. He scored 26 victories in 129 starts, highlighted by a 1965 Daytona 500 crown. However, at the end of 1967, he unexpectedly retired from competition, citing ulcers and loss of weight. For the next couple of years, Lorenzen would tinker with the stock market. That is, until everything crashed near 1970 and he lost everything. By this time, he also had an itch to return to NASCAR, one too good not to scratch. Lorenzen would attempt the 1970 World 600, making the race and finishing 24th. For that season and the next season, he ran races sparingly, and despite running up front in a number of races and nearly winning a race at Dover late into 1971, some of his competitive edge had been lost. By the fall of 1972, Lorenzen bowed out for the final time and headed back to Illinois. Charging Charlie Glotzbach is an interesting talent in NASCAR history, with a career that's more than worth the video in and of himself. There's plenty to talk about with his 12 poles and impeccable qualifying speed, 4 wins, and the fact he finished in the top 10 and 50 of his 124 starts in the Cup Series. There's plenty of stories to tell, like the fact he had broken ribs and was shot twice during an altercation with an employee he was firing off his race team in 1969, only to return at the 1970 Daytona 500 and continue to run competitively with one of the bullets still in his shoulder. Throughout the rest of the 1970s, he ran a limited schedule, attempting a race here and a race there. However, after the 1976 World 600 where he finished 34th, it seemed like Glotzbach had hung it up for good. But racers love to race, and Charlie was back at it in 1981 in the Fall Charlotte race, only to leave again and then come back again after a 7-year absence. Some competitive ARCA stints in 1987 gave him the itch to return in 1988. However, a series of DNQs would ensue, but he wouldn't give up, ultimately making a race at Daytona in 1990. He continued driving for the next few years, even increasing involvement in 1992 for Junie Donlavey, but ultimately made his last attempt at the 1994 Brickyard 400. Yes, that inaugural Brickyard 400 that saw 86 cars try for 43 spots. Unfortunately, Glotzbach, aged 56 at the time, wasn't part of the race. The next year would see another old face try and make a comeback, Richard Brickhouse. Best known for his questionable win in the first ever Talladega race, he also racked up 13 top 10s and even held the world record for the fastest time on a closed circuit for many years. However, after the 1982 Rockingham race, Brickhouse hung the helmet up, at least for the time being. In 1995, he attempted a comeback, age 55, at Rockingham, driving for former driver Dick Skillett. The comeback was cut short as he would crash in qualifying. Yet another name who couldn't escape from the sting of the racing bug is handsome Harry Gant. After finishing 4th in points in 1992, Gant seemed like a favorite for the 1993 championship. However, what would ensue was a winless campaign in 1993, which saw him finish 11th in points. So for 1994, he announced that would be his final season in the sport. He would finish the season with a pole, 7 top 10s, and a 25th place points finish, which was certainly a damper on a career that saw him win 18 times, all over the age of 40. However, we wouldn't see the last of Harry Gant, at least not yet. In 1996, Bill Elliott sustained injuries from a violent airborne crash at Talladega Superspeedway. For the next several races, several drivers would sub in for him, one of them being Harry Gant. 56-year-old Gant drove the familiar McDonald's 94 Ford in the 1996 All-Star race, running in the back of the pack for most of the race and ultimately finishing 15th. The race did give him the itch to run in the new Craftsman Truck Series, where he ran several races for himself on a partial schedule from the middle of the season to the end. He did surprisingly well, racking up 4 top 10s out of his 11 starts. However, this wouldn't prompt him to run more races, and the 1996 Fall Las Vegas Truck Race, where he finished 21st, is the last we'd see of Gant in NASCAR. Not even Darrell Waltrip kept his word after his retirement. After the 2000 season, a year that continued to put up the same poor results Waltrip had put up for years in the late 90s, which he dubbed as Darrell Waltrip's victory tour, many wondered what he would do next. With the personality he boasted, the next move was only natural: a color commentator for Fox Sports, a role that cemented his famous phrase during the green flag from 2001 to 2019, and briefly in 2022. However, in 2002, Waltrip made his return at Martinsville Speedway with HT Motorsports in the Truck Series, finishing a distant 34th. At IRP, however, he finished a very impressive 6th, which convinced him that he still had that competitive edge. So for 2003, he ran for his brother's new team, Michael Waltrip Racing, at the 2 Martinsville races and IRP, recording finishes of 7th, 29th, and 7th respectively. In 2004, he ran for his own team at the same 3 races, having a string of disappointing finishes, even failing to qualify for one. He tried again in 2005 at the Spring Martinsville race, failing to qualify, and then for the last time in the Truck Series in the fall, finishing 13th. He wasn't done from NASCAR for good though. The following year, he made his first Busch Series start since 1995 in Martinsville in the fall, driving the number 99 Aaron's Dodge for his brother. The 20th place finish officially ended Darrell Waltrip's racing career. Next, we have James Hilton, one of the best Cup drivers that almost no one talks about today. Scoring 2 wins, 301 top 10s, and 4 poles, his career spans many years, and he took part in several championship battles. One of them in his first ever year in 1966, where he scored the best finish for a Cup rookie in NASCAR history, 2nd. A competitive racer at heart, he raced for several years as an independent. Unfortunately, NASCAR was steering away from the sport where you could tinker with some tools in your garage to one where you had to have a full-fledged team, and eventually, the sport caught up to Hilton. Top 5s turned into top 10s, which turned into top 20s, which turned into backmarker results, which eventually turned into DNQs. Several failed attempts followed in the late 1980s and early 1990s, until his famous 48 left after Rockingham in 1995, before returning with a certain Jimmie Johnson a couple of years later. Despite this, Hilton would attempt the Daytona 500, 12 years later, aged 72. He would fail to qualify, but the attempt is still very impressive. He didn't make many starts in the Xfinity Series, only ever running 4 races in 1982, 2006, 2008, and his last in 2011 at Darlington, finishing 43rd. Later that year, he made a start at Pocono in the trucks, finishing 30th. And 2 years later, he hung it up for good in a series he had raced for in a long time, a series where he made a name for himself, the Menard Series. Nearly 80 years old, Hilton finished 18th at Kansas in 2013. His legacy lives on though. Hilton was a team owner in ARCA for several years following his retirement, fielding the 48 for several drivers, one of them being Brad Smith, who became the sole driver beginning in 2017. Things were going to plan that year, and the first 3 races of 2018, when tragedy struck. James Hilton, his son, and their crew chief were killed in a car accident on their way back to the shop. Brad Smith would begin running the team by himself, which he still does to this day. He flies under the radar, never in the championship conversation, but usually near the top 5 in points. As one of the hardest working full-time independents in ARCA, he carries James Hilton's legacy. Next is Ricky Rudd, who announced that he would be taking a break from racing post-2005 and hanging it up on 23 wins. Rudd was never one for the public eye, and leaving the buzz of NASCAR and taking a break was just a mental reset he needed. He wouldn't leave long though, as in 2006, he'd run Dover for an ailing Tony Stewart, who suffered a fractured right shoulder blade after an accident in Charlotte. A 4-time winner of the Monster Mile, the Rooster showed everyone what he could do in a Joe Gibbs Racing entry, qualifying 10th. Stewart would start the Dover race, but Rudd would be on standby. After 38 laps, Stewart needed Rudd, and Rudd would finish the race in 25th place, 2 laps down. Though since Stewart started the race, he would be awarded the points, not Rudd. However, Rudd just couldn't bear to be away from the track for a season longer, and he signed to Yates Racing full-time for 2007. Things went okay for the team, mostly posting mid-pack results, and only a 7th at the Coke 600 of any noteworthiness. Late into the season, right before the summer Richmond race, Rudd, the Ironman, known for his series of consecutive starts, would miss a race for the first time due to an injury. He'd missed 5 races, ultimately returning for the final 6, not just of 2007, but of his career. At age 51, Ricky Rudd realized his time in NASCAR was up. One driver who seemingly never grasped the concept of retirement was Mark Martin. At the beginning of 2005, Martin announced that he would be retiring. His results the last couple of years heading into that season were pretty solid, but it seemed his championship contending days were well behind him. 2005 saw a pretty solid campaign by Mark, scoring his 35th win at Kansas and closing off his NASCAR career, finishing 4th in points. Well, that was a pretty good career. Oh wait, Jack Roush can't find a replacement for Mark? Well, it seems like Kurt Busch is out due to a bit of a run-in with the authorities, and Jamie McMurray, who's supposed to replace Mark, is now set to replace Kurt. Roush Racing doesn't have a set-in-stone plan as to what they want to do with Mark, so they ask him to come back for one more year. If 2006 was any other year other than a fill-in until they found someone else, then it'd be pretty disappointing, with Mark going winless and only managing to finish 9th in points. Despite this, everyone would have one more year to say their final goodbyes to this Hall of Famer. And then it'd be over for him, right? Well, no. He ran a partial schedule for Gant Racing in 2007 and DEI in 2008, before running the full schedule for Hendrick Motorsports in 2009, 10, and 11, and a partial schedule for MWR in 2012 and 2013. He would get 5 more wins in the process, nearly winning a Daytona 500 as well, and nearly winning a championship. However, Mark was not oblivious to his age or his competitiveness, and after Homestead in 2013, he quietly retired for good. Well, unless you count his 2014 Daytona preseason test appearance. In fact, Martin could have ran some races in 2014, most likely the Sprint Unlimited or Daytona 500, if Tony Stewart still hadn't recovered from his injuries that he sustained late into 2013. Speaking of that Daytona preseason test in 2014, it featured a return of another familiar face, 55-time winner and 1989 NASCAR Cup champion Rusty Wallace. In a time where his fellow competitors use the word retirement with air quotes surrounding its syllables, a man committed to the retirement home in the mid-2000s was an oddity among the rest. Rusty Wallace was committed to retiring for good from his driving duties post-2005 and shot down any offer that came his way, a decision he later regretted. He would run the 2006 Rolex 24, but other than that, his motorsports days were numbered. However, in 2014, he would swap seats with Brad Keselowski in preseason Thunder and make some laps around the Daytona International Speedway, driving the Miller Lite 2 that he claimed to fame all those decades ago. Fast forwarding a year, we'd see one of the biggest retirements in the last 10 years, the retirement of 93-time winner, 4-time champion, and 3-time Daytona 500 winner, Jeff Gordon. Gordon's 2015 season was, quite frankly, magical, scoring a win at Martinsville and punching his ticket into the championship four. The previous year saw him lose what he seemed so close to getting, and there was a possibility of him going out with a bang and going out with the cup. Unfortunately, he finished 6th on track and 3rd in points, but it still was a pretty good career for what it was worth. Well, there was one more chapter, a bonus chapter of sorts to add to this book. With Dale Earnhardt Jr. out with a concussion in the middle of 2016, Gordon was brought back and shared the 88 with a young up-and-coming talent in Alex Bowman. In his last 2 starts, he finished in the top 10. Fast forwarding a couple of years, we have one of the most out-of-the-blue comebacks of any drivers on this list, Bill Elliott in 2018. Bill had run sparingly in the Cup Series up until his last race at the Coke Zero 400 in 2012. However, Bill would come back for a one-off in 2018 with GMS Racing at Road America of all places, and Elliott proved it wasn't just for show, as he finished a pretty solid 20th on the day. 2-time Xfinity Series champion Dale Earnhardt Jr. also made a comeback that 2018 season. After he retired at the end of 2017, many suspected that was it for him, as he wouldn't want to risk another concussion. However, the 50-time NASCAR National Series winner wasn't completely done with holding a wheel. Jr. would return for a one-off at Richmond in late 2018, driving the number 88 for his team Junior Motorsports. Despite finishing 4th, his best finish in this yearly tradition of his, he dominated the entire race and had a car that could contend. From 2018 to 2022, he ran 1 race in the Xfinity Series, but in 2023, he'll be upping that number up to 2. 2 years later, and we would see the return of another Hall of Famer in Matt Kenseth. When Joe Gibbs Racing announced that Kenseth would be replaced with Eric Jones after the 2017 season, it definitely shocked some people, and not the least in Kenseth, in the sense that he felt like he hadn't completely closed out his Cup Series career. However, after the 2017 season, Roush Fenway Racing, a team that he really cemented his legacy with the championship and 2 Daytona 500s, welcomed him back for a partial schedule. While his first race at Kansas wouldn't go as planned, the next several races saw some solid runs. He won a stage at Indianapolis and finished off the season with back-to-back top 10s. This proved to RFR that they didn't have an equipment problem, rather a driver problem, leading to Bain's departure and Ryan Newman's arrival the following year. The next year, Kenseth won the Slinger Nationals, though that's the only motorsports event he participated in. He was enjoying his retirement well into 2020, when in April, Kyle Larson couldn't hear someone at Monza. As we all know, he was subsequently suspended for the rest of the season, which meant Chip Ganassi Racing was looking for a replacement. That replacement being Matt Kenseth, who'd be paired up with his former Roush teammate Kurt Busch. Kenseth's first race went really well, finishing 10th and seemingly picking up right where he left off. A couple weeks later, and he nearly won the Brickyard 400. However, other than these two races, he was pretty terrible, ultimately finishing the season off 28th in points. And after the 2020 season finale at Phoenix, where he finished 25th, he officially announced his retirement from NASCAR for good. Speaking of Indianapolis, the following year saw the return of one of its winners, Paul Menard. Menard announced in September of 2019 that he would be retiring from NASCAR and would be handing the keys to the 21 to Matt Benedetto. And while the consistent, rock-solid driver's last Cup race occurred at Homestead, Miami, the 17th place finish wasn't his final NASCAR start. In 2021, Menard returned to Circuit of the Americas, driving the number 66 Toyota Tundra for Thorsport Racing. He ran a pretty solid race and finished a decent 11th, and continued to improve upon that with the top 10 at Watkins Glen. It's unclear as to whether this is officially his last ever start, as the door is always open for Paul to come back. 19-time Cup Series winner Greg Biffle took one of the longest sabbaticals from the Cup Series, with the 6-year absence spanning 2016 and 2022, although he did make some NASCAR Sanctioned Series starts in this time. Kyle Busch pegged Biffle to make a one-off for him in 2019, which he did at Texas Motor Speedway. Biffle would start 6th and quickly work his way up to the front, leading 18 laps. He outlasted the dominant truck of Grant Enfinger to score his first win in the truck since 2001. The following year saw him make another one-off, this time for GMS Racing at Darlington, though this one didn't go as well as the last, with him ultimately finishing 19th. However, a couple years later, he would get in touch with John Cohan, who was in the middle of starting a Cup team, NY Racing. They would make their series debut at the Daytona 500, making the race and finishing 36th. He would run a couple more races that were mostly disappointing, though a 20th at Atlanta was kind of a bright spot. Thus far, Talladega seems to be their last race together, and based off some rumors, it seems the team is shut down, and Biffle's NASCAR comeback was cut just a little short. And the final driver we'll talk about is 7-time champion, 83-time winner, Jimmie Johnson. We all know what kind of a career he had behind him: 5 championships in a row, 4 All-Star wins, 4 Coke 600s, 4 Brickyard 400s, 2 Southern 500s, and many, many more accolades. All of this happened behind the wheel of a Hendrick Motorsports entry and with the number 48 plastered on the side. Jimmie announced at the beginning of 2020 he would be running his final season in NASCAR, which didn't surprise many, as the last couple of years of his career were pretty rough. After his NASCAR career ended, he pursued a career in IndyCar, which, let's just say, didn't go as successfully as many hoped. For 2023, Jimmie plans to run a variety of bucket list events, as well as make his return to NASCAR on a partial schedule with Petty GMS, beginning at the Daytona 500. On top of that, he has an ownership stake in the organization. It'll be interesting to see how Jimmie adapts with the next Shankar, and how well he'll perform on this limited schedule. So, there you have it, some of the most eminent and distinguished names of the past who have made some comebacks. Now, I want to hear from you. What are some of the most memorable comebacks that you remember? What are some drivers who made some comebacks but were not mentioned in this video? Let me know down in the comments below, and until next time, this has been the news. I'll see you.